As I mentioned in the last podcast, what I want to do is spend a little time looking at Feng Shui. Feng Shui in the traditional Chinese form, which we're going to spend more time on, is actually intimately interrelated with Ming Shui. Feng Shui is the movement of qi on the landscape. Ming Shui basically numerology. So in the Asian system, the time that you're born down to the minute. In fact, traditionally in most of Asia, when you're born, there'll actually be a midwife or one of the staffers when you pop out of your mom that will actually time it. So my relatives all have their birth time. They not only have the day and the year and everything, but they actually have the minute that they were born. And the reason for that is in the Asian context, if you go back to the very beginning, especially we're talking about sociobiology, one aspect of that, at least in the Asian systems, are the attitude that the moment that you're born, you actually end up sort of partaking of certain aspects of behavioral potential that are unique to that point in time. And this goes back to the idea of cycles and sort of circular patterns. So, for example, I'm a snake, but I'm actually technically a dragon snake by virtue of the sequence of when I was born. So that actually gives me more theoretical potential to be certain things and a lot less potential to be other things. It's not so much like Western astrology where it will happen, but it's very much in that, some stuff that you might like to do if you, depending on when you're born, you're just never going to be, you just don't have the skill set to do it. Or more usefully, what happened is you might be able to do it, but it'll be a lot harder for you. And there'll be other stuff that you're almost innately easier. It's easier for you to do because you're more structured for that. So feng shui in terms of place, one of the huge difference between feng shui and the Asian sense and feng shui in the sort of what I would call the Euro-American sense, if you watch those videos, is that feng shui in the Asian sense is person specific. So my wife and I, for example, are different signs. She's rooster and I'm snake. So that's actually handy because those two signs are compatible. So even down to, for example, your companion, who you marry and such, that will be in Asian systems. That's defined by compatible birth animals, birth years, birth behavior packages. So some people I would not be an appropriate significant other for because our potentials and our potential personality traits or we're more inclined to would be almost invariably mutually incompatible. So you might have a relationship, but it's really, really hard to make it work. Whereas another relationship that are compatible signs would be much easier. There's a much, sort of easier fit. I think maybe the easiest way to phrase it is the term of friction. Um, Things that are compatible have less friction attached to them. And so the purpose of feng shui is that it has to be person specific. So, for example, my feng shui and my wife's feng shui are different. They're very, very close because, again, we're compatible things in the Chinese logic. But for example, if my significant other were rat, which is one of the other Chinese signs, one of the other Chinese packages, you might say, that would be any feng shui design in, for example, of an interior that would be good for me would be very uncomfortable for someone who's the sign of the rat, and vice versa. So when you do feng shui in the Asian system, specifically Chinese and Korean, and also Southeast Asia, which is the Chinese system, what you'll find is the first thing that people want to know that are doing the work, the specialist, would be they need to know when you were born. This is oftentimes called Baji, is actually the chart. And it's a very complicated piece of kit. It takes a fair amount of time to do them. Let me very quickly pop you over to see what this looks like. If you're actually interested in this, I would recommend going to this particular site. This is Joey Yap's Mastery Academy. He's from Singapore. He has turned this whole incredibly esoteric and highly intellectualized process of feng shui into a real money-making proposition. It's really sort of interesting to look in terms of taking something that most people would not want to get anywhere near, even in, for example, Chinese society. Very few people understand feng shui, and then if you do, you're invariably defined as a shifu. And in modern China, Korea, and rest, especially Southeast Asia, like Singapore, these folks generate a lot of income. I can't imagine what it costs to have Joey App personally do feng shui for a place or a business or a building, but it would be pricey. So this particular site's really interesting because among other things, it's sort of a bait to get you to actually get trained and learn about this stuff. That actually have free online, uh, sort of tutorials where, among other things, you can actually build out your and understand, find out what your actual feng shui chart would be, your Baji chart. In other words, the days that are good for you, things like this. And these are all this incredibly complicated stuff is all part of feng shui. And this is, I think, in large part is why to Euro Americans, it's just, I assume a fair number of people take this class or take training in it, but it's very esoteric and it's very complex for folks that just want to get a result, especially because the result's going to be person specific. So, I've trained in this and my wife's trained in it, so we're familiar with it. But the first thing you have to tell people is, well, if you get asked to do someone's feng shui, for example, in quotes, they get really perturbed when you say you need to know everyone that lives in the house. And you have to then point out to them that, what might be good for one person might actually be quite bad for someone else. And so, at that point, they sort of go, well, don't bother because I want something that'll be quick, it'll work, and it'll work for everyone. This is basically that logic is the fundamental basis of Euro-American feng shui, or what's called Euro-American feng shui. But its Asian counterpart is very, very person specific and intimately tied to people who would be basically fortune tellers, which are the folks that do Ming Shui. And so this is a fascinating site if you want to just see how this works. I wouldn't get into it unless you really want to dive into it because it's really complicated. Having said that, you can get people that actually will do this for you. But it's again, you got to think through just exactly what the consequences, for example, of paying someone to do traditional Chinese feng shui when it's only going to be for you. And one of the aspects of traditional Chinese feng shui is in every 12-year cycle, it changes. So back about 7 years ago, I think it was, we went through one of the 12-year cycles. And so what happened is a lot of folks that were Chinese or Southeast Asian that actually, have this belief system, including Vietnamese, for example, had to either sell properties or modify things because at the end of this cycle, then all of a sudden, not so much the rules change, but what's good or bad for every individual changes. So it's a constantly dynamic process, and so this is why you can actually go online, and of course I'm sure he has these both as digital and all sorts of stuff. Every year you have to find out what your feng shui is for the upcoming year. For in this case 2023. All right, I can't remember what the Chinese number here is. What this also means, of course, is that Ming Shui also works the same way. So if you go to like Bondi-Zin, the huge sort of business temple, Taoist temple in Hong Kong, there's a whole building, a 5-story building that has nothing but Ming Shui fortune tellers. And so you go and burn incense at the temple, then you go to the fortune tellers and they'll tell what your fortune is going to be for that year. So not surprisingly, around New Year's, the place is packed. You can also find folks that are contracted out to do feng shui. So it's, this is a major part of sort of Asian conceptual logic. And notice how, among other things, what it means is every individual is tied to the landscape in a different way. Every individual is tied to the interior of their house and the furniture and every aspect of that house in a different way. So, on one hand, if you go back to the Calvinists and such like that, we tend to think of the Euro-American, especially American concept, as the sort of hyper individualism, which, in some ways it actually is. But then, of course, the counter stereotype is, well, Asians, everyone tries to conform, everyone has to be part of the same thing. The nail that gets stuck up gets hammered down. All these sort of, stereotypes of Asians being basically the same. If you look at Feng Shui, Ming Shui, then it's exactly the opposite. Euro Americans want to go to a shop like the one I think that's still in Kapiolani or Kapahulu and buy something that'll work and it'll work for everyone. So it's very sort of generic. Their Asian counterparts who are in the traditional system have to have something that works for them, and every year it will change. I think I don't know if Joey Yap does it, but some of the other folks that do this stuff actually every year you're supposed to have different physical objects in different places in, say, your office or your home to help you generate or acquire good chi or keep out bad chi. and you have to change those every year. And there's a huge industry in this. If you go to someplace like Hong Kong or Singapore, uh, or even Vietnam, for example, where it's hugely popular. So traditional feng shui is a very complex subject, and so I just want to touch over some of the logics of it. The best way to probably think of this is if you've actually looked through one of your readings is, of course, is the Hawaiian geomancy, which you could say in some ways is sort of Hawaiian feng shui, is sort of doing a contrast and compare of the logics of the two. They're actually very, very similar. I've never seen any particular discussion of this. I think because the Hawaiian feng shui is so rarely understood. But it's interesting when you look at the two of them, they have some very similar logics in terms of how the landscape works, how structures work, and how the interiors of structures work vis-a-vis individuals. And again, as with its Chinese counterpart, much of the Hawaiian feng shui is actually fairly significantly individual based. So traditional feng shui sort of plays out this way. So let's take a look at some of the sort of basic premises of traditional feng shui. Okay, so if we're looking at traditional feng shui, the basic premise or principle is oftentimes called circulation. So the idea that qi or life energy flows through the landscape. I think in some ways it'd probably be more accurate to say it's hydraulic because it generally doesn't go upstream per se. So you can almost visualize like water, some other fluid. So the qi in the landscape is generated by stuff, whatever it might be, and then it tends to flow, if you would, downhill. And it tends to flow in what's usually called in, I suppose, translated to English, in veins. So it doesn't just sort of like flow like a sheet over the landscape. It's concentrated in particular things, and these are features. And so what you'll find is that particular types of ridges, for example, are called Dragon Ridge. Chaminad's on one. And that particular feature is actually seen as having basically a vein or a river, if you would, or a stream of qi moving through it from upslope to downslope. And so what that would mean is where you place buildings, where you especially place houses, you have to be very, very careful about that because that has a lot of energy. Flat areas don't tend to have a lot of qi because, again, it just sort of think of fluid like water, just sort of comes out as a sheet. So everything gets a little feng shui or a little qi, but it's not going to get a lot. Landforms like, for example, drop-offs are water's going to disappear over the side of it. So, for example, having your house on the side of a ridge like Hawaii Lower Ridge would be for a traditional feng shui specialist would be a bad idea. So there's a set of premises about how the landscape works. And it's really interesting because if you go back and look at the Hawaiian stuff, the Waialae, you'll find that it's actually very similar. I'm not sure. I think a lot of this is just based on practicality. Having your house on a cliff is a bad idea. As folks in Palolo recently discovered, having your house at the bottom of a cliff is a bad idea. So a lot of this is just sort of practicality. But there's also parts of it that are sort of interesting in the function, for example, of spines as ridges. And so the other part of this is that different than the Hawaiian, is that in the Chinese concept, there's a very strong attitude that there's basically hot qi and cold qi, sheng qi and sha qi. And these are two, if you would, variant forms. I think the closest parallel might be positive and negative when you're thinking of electricity. They're both useful, but again, what you want is a balance between them. You don't want too much sheng, and you don't want too much shi. You need to have the in between. And so, depending on where you place a house, or for example, where you place a door, where you place a bed, the head of a bed, all of these can either attract more or less of one type of energy or the other. And so, a huge part of traditional feng shui is moving furniture around, especially areas where you spend a lot of time, like bedrooms where you sleep. And especially because when you rest, you're supposed to be regenerating qi. So, restful time, whether it be awake or asleep, is a huge part of Asian interior design, tied, basically based on premises tied to feng shui. I mean, even folks that don't do feng shui will almost invariably follow the placement of bed rules in Korean, Chinese, Southeast Asian societies. Japanese, not so much. Japanese have concepts of feng shui. You see it in the countryside. Japanese rural architecture is still entirely feng shui driven, but it largely disappears by the 1920s and 30s, I think, because the Chinese government, when it went into the highly militarized period of the 20s and 30s, decided that traditional feng shui, like a lot of traditional attitudes like Shinto and Buddhism and stuff, were not part of the modern Japanese state. And they basically wiped it out. And this is the same period when Japan suddenly switched to a Western style New Year's type calendar versus the Asian calendar it always had before. So Japan's sort of an interesting place because when you go there, depending on where you are in Japan, a lot of it will have the same logic you find in the rest of Asia. Other parts, especially in the urban, more modernized areas, don't really seem to be very Asian in some cases. They're still very Japanese, but a lot of this doesn't tend to be seen. Um, the other part that you see again, in Asian design, this has to do with this idea of balance, which is absolutely central to Feng Shui. Good Feng Shui is balance of energies. Yin and Yang is probably the most common. This would be the classic EID-GE symbol that you see. What's it, Town and Country, I think, uses it as a logo. Yin being dark, female, moon, cold, water. Yang being light, male, sun, heaven, dragon, heat. These are, again, you're not supposed to be one or the other. In fact, if you go to a Chinese doctor because you're not feeling well, they will almost invariably point out to you that you're either too yin or too yang. And a large part of Chinese medicine, just as I think I mentioned before, with Chinese and Korean food, when you consume a complete meal, you're supposed to balance out the amount of yin and yang in the meal. Or, for example, if you're low in yin, then you're going to want to eat certain stuff because that will bring that yin up. That'll bring that qi potential up and limit the amount of yang. So these are basic premises in Asian societies. You see down to everything, including, for example, the clothes that you wear, because colors are yin or yang. And so even fabrics and textures are yin and yang. So, the textures and fabrics that you have in a room could make that room more yin or more yang. And depending on every individual that's going to use that room, it'll have different impacts on them because everyone has different amounts and different potentials of yin and yang. So again, there's no distinction made between what you might call architecture, construction, interiors, fabrics, and colors that you would see in the Western concept, where if you're an interior designer, you do this, but you don't do that. In the Asian context, Feng Shui provides principles and guidance and basically, in many cases, rules that just cross that entire spectrum. The other case that's really important, and this again is very true of Asian societies. Asian societies are incredibly symbolic. They're not unique in this regard. I would argue that many European societies are also very, very symbolic, especially if you think like the early Celtic systems you still find in places like Ireland and Wales. But in Asian systems, this is still very much the way it goes. I think the classic example you would see is in most of Asia, the quality of your writing, i.e. what we would call calligraphy, is still an important social commodity. Being able to write pretty, I guess, for lack of a better term, to write artistically, is still a major manifestation of sophistication and style everywhere in Asia, whether it be Japan, China, Korea, whatever. The Korean writing system is different, but they still have very strict rules about what is good calligraphy, good art, and it's seen as a form of art. And you can immediately gain prestige just literally, if you're signing something, even maybe a hotel register or something. If you're using good calligraphy, the person on the other side who's, working at the hotel will have a different attitude about you just because of that. So symbolism in the sense of how things look is actually more important in many cases than what they are. And so I think in the Western context, there's sort of a mix between the two. For example, I think a fence is a very specific object, for example, for the Calvinist in Williamsburg. The fact that it's white is entirely symbolic. But it's an in-between in terms of some aspects that are actually based in physical reality. Others are sort of symbolic and therefore have meaning based on sort of shared group, analysis or shared group translation, if you would, of the image or the smell or the taste or whatever. In Asian societies, that symbolism is absolutely dominant. And this, I think, is one reason why when people go to Asia, if they're in Japan, Korea, China, wherever, they find it very, very hard to figure out what's going on because almost everything around you is entirely symbolic. And what that means is you can't look at an object and figure out what its purpose or meaning is. And I think in Western societies, there's a real, I think, especially in American society, because folks are so highly mobile and there's so little, attachment to place, that things have to be pretty physically there because people don't have a strong symbolic component. If you're just moved to a neighborhood, how would you know what your neighbors, perceive the world around them, which is symbolism. So in Asian society, you have that sort of shared symbolic understanding. Now, it of course varies from society to society, and even parts, for example, one part of China from another will be highly symbolic different. But nonetheless, in that community, in that region, you'll find a huge amount of consensus about symbols and the use of symbols. And of course, one of the huge impacts of symbols is the fact that symbols can communicate enormously complex meanings just in a particular visual image or something like that. What is the old trite? Picture's worth 1,000 words. A symbol is worth, in some cases, 10,000 words. And so what you'll find is this is probably most striking in Japanese society, of people can have very dense communication going on with just a few symbols. But if you're not aware of those symbols and then basically that communication logic, you won't have any clue what the hell's going on, because there's nothing in what those people are doing that actually ties back to the communication they're trying to have. The classic example would be the Japanese bow, which is incredibly complex symbolically. It ties in all sorts of different aspects of Japanese society. But folks outside of Japan, including even China, for example, because the Chinese don't use the bow the same way, they might bow, but they don't understand the nuances of it, or the very complex, what the Hawaiians would call kauna, or multiple meanings that are attached to something as simple as that movement. And so this is probably a really huge part of this, because much of Feng Shui is very, very, very symbolic. And therefore, it's not going to be understandable to folks that aren't aware of the messaging that's taking place. It's oftentimes, Feng Shui is oftentimes translated, and you'll see this in all the books, as wind and water. And again, this idea of wind is a form of qi, it's a form of movement. Anything that moves is actually seen as qi in the Asian system of Feng Shui. Again, very similar to the Hawaiian. Feng Shui can also exist in particular types of objects. So in that regard, it's exactly when we were talking about mana earlier in the semester, it's exactly the same. There's no difference between the Chinese, if you would, and the Hawaiian. In fact, it's what you find rather interesting if you're talking or interact or get trained by Chinese Feng Shui specialists, and you know the Hawaiian, you can actually go to a spot and you'll find that they have exactly the same interpretation of the amount of mana or chi that location would have as their Hawaiian counterpart. There wasn't any communication between the two. They're entirely separate views of the world and reality and energy. But it's interesting how they end up with sort of very similar sort of interpretations of that.